Hey Webters, Mr. Lassiter with you today, and as we get into crunch time, we're going to be doing a couple of these lectures through video to make sure that we have enough time to cover the information we need before you get to your exam. So today we're going to be looking at Spanish America and Brazil. Brazil, of course, occupied by the Portuguese during this time. So let's go ahead and get started. The Spanish Empire includes most of the Caribbean, Mexico, the American Southwest, Central America, much of South America, including the Caribbean and Pacific coastlines, and the Andean highlands. Also areas that make up modern-day Bolivia and Uruguay and Argentina. The Portuguese, on the other hand, settle the Brazilian coast. And modern-day Brazil, of course, is in where their land holdings were. Colonial societies, though were not based necessarily on their own standards, they were based mostly on those of the ruling class's homelands. So the class system, the fact that these places became Catholic, they were patriarchal, these were Spanish and Portuguese things they brought over in the Columbian Exchange, the social class system itself. Even so, though, we do see that the native Indians had a major influence on the development in colonial life. For example, we're going to see time and again that even though Catholic beliefs are instilled in this area, local beliefs and practices kind of survive kind of underneath the Catholic ideas. So that's kind of important to make sure we understand. And then also, the African slave trade is going to add a third cultural stream to colonial America, which will have a major impact on this region. So let's start talking about state and the church. The Spanish crown tried to exert direct control over its American colonies. They established the Council of the Indies to supervise all government, ecclesiastical, and commercial activity in the Spanish colonies. The geography and the fact that there was not the technology for long-distance communication, this limits the council's real power. After all, it took about 200 days to make a round-trip voyage from Spain to Mexico, and an additional few months to travel to places like Lima, Peru. So due to this lack of communication, viceroys of New Spain and Peru were established. And so in these areas, these viceroys or kind of representatives of the crown enjoyed a substantial degree of power. And even the people that they were in charge of had that same kind of degree of autonomy. In 1720, so that's kind of Spain, in 1720, after years of kind of neglect and mismanagement, the Portuguese eventually have to appoint their own viceroy to administer Brazil. These institutions are pretty uniform. They cost a lot of money, and they stuck to the mission to make money for Spain and Portugal. So we see that taxes paid in Spanish America by silver and gold mines, and in Brazil by sugar plantations, fund these large colonial bureaucracies. And while these institutions were pretty responsive to the needs of the people in the colonies, because of the amount of control, there's not a whole lot of economic or political experimentation, initiative in these regions. The church plays a very important role in transferring European culture to the New World. Language, culture, Christian beliefs, all these things. We see a conversion of a large number of American Indians, although a lot of them keep their native beliefs and practices, and this led to a lot of conflict between the Spanish and the American Indians. Catholic clergy sometimes we see actually protects Amerindians from exploitation and abuse. For example, Bartolome de las Casas was a priest who denounced Spanish policies, and he worked real hard to improve the status of American Indians through legal reform. He developed the New Laws of 1542, which was reform legislation that, among other things, outlawed the enslavement of Amerindians and limited other forms of forced labor, which we're going to see in a minute, and that's in picture. Overall, Catholic missionaries become pretty frustrated as Amerindian converts blended Christian beliefs with elements of their own beliefs and rituals. So we see cultural borrowings in, for example, the indigenous beliefs and rituals that were associated with saints' feast days or feasts associated with the Virgin Mary. Very kind of Catholic ideals that kind of blend with local culture. In response to epidemic deaths, also the church begins concentrating on cities and towns rather than kind of the countryside. These are as a result of kind of the epidemics like smallpox, etc., that we talked about with the Columbian Exchange. So the Catholic Church founds universities and secondary schools, and this also plays a significant role in intellectual and economic life in the colonies. On the right, you can see the Cathedral of Lima, Peru, completed in 1538, which has its original facade, even though it's been renovated several times in the last 500 years or so. Overall, the colonial economies in the Americas were dominated by silver mines and sugar plantations. They actually become very dependent on these mineral and agricultural exports to Europe. And these mineral wealths, for example, silver and gold, actually play a large role in funding Europe's expansion of trade into Asia. The economy of Spanish colonies is dominated by silver mines of Bolivia and Peru until about 1680, and then silver mines of Mexico become very important. One of the biggest silver mines that your book mentions is at Potosi, which was in what is now Bolivia. It was one of the single richest silver deposits found in the Americas. Silver mining and processing did require a large labor force. You can see in this diagram a typical silver refinery. But it had negative environmental effects. For example, to remove the silver from the ore, they would burn a lot of trees, so there was deforestation because they had to heat up this ore. Later on, they find a new way of doing it using mercury, but of course, mercury is a poison, and it contaminated the environment, it sickened the workforce, so several negative environmental effects. Of course, this labor force is exploited. I don't think there's any way to put that nicely. Up until the 1540s, the Spanish settlers had used a labor system called encomienda. But as epidemics and mistreatments led to the decline of these populations, and reforms such as the new laws came along, they were looking to reform these practices. So that didn't necessarily mean that it came out in a good way. With the development of silver mining economies, we see new systems of labor exploitation devised. For example, free wage labor in Mexico and the mita in Peru. Now, we've talked about the mita before when learning about the Inca, but this is kind of a more extreme form of that. 1/7 of adult male Amerindians were drafted for forced labor at very low wages for about 6 months a year. But this undermined the traditional agricultural economy because they were being actually required to do more than this. And so we actually see with the mita system men working much longer time periods than had actually than would have been normal, let's say, under the Inca. And so that takes them away from their farms. Therefore, the agricultural economy weakens. It weakens village life. And so instead, we see men kind of moving almost full time to mining activities. And this promotes, of course, an assimilation of Amerindians into Spanish colonial society as they move into the cities or large villages. So let's jump over to the Portuguese, away from the Spanish. They developed a slave labor system. So again, more exploitation of workers. Originally, they used Amerindians to work on the sugarcane plantations, or as you see in the picture, I believe that's Brazil wood farming, tree farming. But later on we see the use of African slaves. They were more expensive because they had to transport them over, but the Portuguese saw them as more productive. And this is primarily because they were disease resistant. They had already been exposed to the old world diseases and therefore were not dying at the same rates. This does not mean that the situation was good by any means. Overall, sugar and silver play important roles in integrating American colonial economies into the system of world trade. So the fact that sugar and silver and a plethora of other New World resources and plants, etc., they become very important to Europe. And so the Americas are kind of brought into this trade system. So let's take a look at society in colonial Latin America. Basically what we're going to see here is a lot of blending of culture. The elite of Spanish America consisted of a relatively small number of Spanish immigrants and a large number of their American-born descendants, or what we call creoles. The Spanish-born dominated the highest levels of government, church, business, and the creoles really controlled agriculture and mining. Under colonial rule, the cultural diversity of Amerindian peoples and the class differentiation within Amerindian ethnic groups were both eroded. Basically, we'll see that there starts to be more of a blending of culture, which actually decreases the diversity in the region. People of African descent played various roles in the history of the Spanish colonies. So kind of going back and seeing how this works with Spain. First and foremost, we see slaves and free blacks from the Iberian Peninsula. They participated in the conquest and settlement of Spanish America. And so we actually see free blacks in the Americas. But with the increase in the number of blacks with the slave trade, we actually see a decline in the legal status of blacks overall in the Spanish colonies. So, whereas it might have started off not quite as poor with the limitation of legal rights, that status declines as we see more and more non-free blacks come over. Of course, like we see with Amerindians, Africans at first retain their cultural identities, but over time they blend and they mix with the cultures that are in the Americas, including Spanish and native culture. So what about slave resistance? Obviously there was some that you read about. This included rebellions, which were always brought under control at some point. But there is this, I think, fairly interesting section that talks about how slaves occasionally ran away and formed groups that defended themselves for years, actually. So we see kind of settlements in Brazil, for example, where slaves have kind of run away and they form quilombos, which were the quilombos were settlements, you could say, where these runaway slaves would set up a village, for example, and they would stay independent pretty much for quite some time. In the Spanish colonies, these were called palenques. One of the largest quilombos in Brazil was Palmeiras, where thousands of slaves defended themselves against Brazilian authorities for about 60 years until they were overrun in 1694. Overall, most slaves were engaged in agricultural labor and were forced to submit to harsh discipline and brutal punishments, as we can see in this painting by Jean-Baptiste Debresse. I think that that might be misspelled there, excuse me. Basically, the plantation overseers disciplining blacks. It was a very harsh system. I can't do it justice in this video, so I'm not going to even try. The overwhelming number of males in slavery also made it impossible, really, for slaves to preserve their traditional African family and marriage patterns, or even to adopt those of Europe, because males are more desirable to bring over for to work in the New World. We see a much larger population of male slaves than female slaves. In colonial Brazil, we see Africans and their American-born descendants eventually become the largest ethnic group, but we also see a lot of cultural blending in the Americas. The growing population of mestizos, which were the offspring of European or Creole fathers and Amerindians, and mixed African American Indian descendants, and mulattoes, which were mixed European and Africans. These are collectively known as castas. And basically, we see kind of a mixing of European, Indian, and African races here. So anyways, these castas dominate small-scale retail and construction in the cities. They run small ranches and farms in rural areas. They work as wage laborers. Overall, operate kind of all over society. It becomes more and more common. Members of these mixed groups who gained high status or significant wealth generally spoke Spanish or Portuguese. Generally, they observed the requirements of Catholicism, and whenever possible, they lived the life of Europeans and their residents, the way they dressed, the food they ate. So we see these castas in general, especially with mestizos and mulattoes, operating or adopting Spanish culture, which is very significant in the idea of this blending society. Alright guys, that's it. Sorry it was fast or maybe long and boring, but nevertheless this is important information for understanding the developing culture of Spanish America and Portuguese Brazil. Make sure you get this in your notes and come ready to learn about the English and French colonies in North America as we wrap up our in-class unit before your exam next week. Have a good day.